American Indians, Chapter 6. Now, I grew up reading all kinds of books about the American Indians. When I was a kid, the Western shows featured a lot of wars between Indians, and we'd go to school bringing our toy guns, and today that's been outlawed, but we played what we call cowboys and Indians, with some of the guns looked real looking. We did not have problems with mass shootings in those days, but some of the guys would bring machine guns, the type of guns that they did not have in the cowboy and Indian days. But we would spend a lot of time, the TV shows featured a whole lot of Indians in them, not always in a favorable light. But anyway, I grew up, began reading a lot of books about Indians. Where did they come from? Folk, your book is going by the standard view that the American Indians came across the Bering Straits. And here's where I wish I had a map. But essentially, I mean, what you have Alaska here. This is Alaska, and this is Siberia here. This is rather crude, and here's the Bering Strait. That during an ice age, this area solidified. The Indians in the game were able to walk across the area. The problem with that story is, and by the way, hey, do write it down because I promise you it'll probably be on either your test or the other classes. So it's on a test, but I want to state I don't believe it. Not one Indian ever told the story that we came across from Asia, even though a lot of them came across from Asia. If you look at the American Indians' DNA, they're a good mixture of European DNA, African DNA, and Mongolian DNA. So if any book will tell you they're all Mongolian, probably not so. Now, where'd they come from? They probably crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and some of them obviously crossed the Pacific Ocean. But they simply came across the ocean, and this is what they told us. That Montezuma told Cortez, we came from across the sea. And there are all kinds of stories about crossing the sea and lands beyond the sea on both sides of the Atlantic. The American Indians knew of land, but that there was a land beyond the sea. They likely crossed the ocean. It is now known that you can cross the Atlantic Ocean anyway in a 18-foot rowboat. This has been proven time and time again. You can't drink the seawater. You have to carry a little bit of water with you. You carry dried food, and you might think you can catch fish. Believe it or not, catching fish in the middle of the ocean is most difficult. One of you looked at me like you knew what I'm talking about. The fish are caught usually on the shallow part on the near land. Get out in the deep, deep ocean, and there just aren't that many fish that bite. Now, I say that you can't drink. There are a few places in the ocean where the water somehow is fresh, probably because of springs shooting up. That's another issue, another story, though. Anyway, the American Indians probably came over by crossing the ocean, perhaps in small craft. According to the standard view, they were started off probably being no more than fruit gatherers, hunters, chasing the crops, chasing the game. And eventually they worked their way from Alaska down to California, and then eventually all the way down through the Isthmus of Panama into South America by starting out in Alaska. At least that's the standard view. There is an alternate view that the American Indians started out with a very, very high level of civilization. How high? Before the class is over, you may realize that some people believe that their civilization level was in fact super high, and maybe even super, super high. And they gradually lost, a lot of them lost their civilization. But
what evidence is there to support that?
Say again?
What evidence is there to support that?
Okay, essentially, there's the Nazca lines in South America that even your book says. I mean, believe it or not, your author book says it looks like, but to some, the authors don't say that they believe it. They look like some. They were built from a vantage point of someone high in space looking down and directing the operation of a radio from someone high in space. This is in the book, the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are a long, straight line. The other evidence is some huge pyramids, one of them as big as the Pyramid of Giza, except it's made of dirt. I've seen it myself, a pyramidical pond. In North America, you have all kinds of cities and mounds that could not have been built by the Indians who were living here when the Europeans came, that were built long by Indians who were much more highly advanced than the ones we found here. Does that begin to satisfy your
I was just wondering.
evidence? In other words, there is evidence that the American Indians living in North America, where we're standing now, were once higher. Have any of you any chance seen the New Echota Indian mounds? I went there back in 1978, then my wife and I went there back in 2014. And the New Echota Indian mounds show that people who had a very, very high level of ability to move lots and lots of dirt. And a lot of the dirt that is used in making Indian mounds is dirt that appears to have been found hundreds of miles from the site of the mound itself. One of you nodded your head like you'd heard this before, indicating a high level of civilization. And also the fact that in Ohio we have a long, long rattlesnake mound. To make something like that, you have to have a high level of geometry. And even either that or the operation was directed from the air by people in radio contact with the ground. This is not what you expected to hear, I guess, but you might have thought of the American Indians being primitive. All right, what happened? If you want my own honest opinion about what happened in North America, the Indians living right here in North America, they became communist. The word communist comes from the word commune. We call them villages. Essentially what they did, they developed a system where they had no class distinctions, everyone was equal, no money, no private ownership of property. And one reason they clashed with Europeans was Europeans insisted on setting up borders. Boundaries, say this is my land here and that land over there is yours, but my land starts at this fence. The American Indians did not understand private property. And that's why one of the reasons they clashed with Europeans. They had no private property, no money, no trade, and everybody got paid whether he worked or not. The productive and hardworking received the same compensation as the unproductive, the lazy. Everybody was equal. The result was their higher level of civilization went down to being, they became a bunch of teepee and wigwam builders and a bunch of nomads who would live at a place for a while until the game left or until the rain stopped. Then they'd pack up and simply move on to another place until the game stopped there, or until they got the area they were living in got so depleted that it wouldn't produce anymore, or so filthy that they couldn't stand their own filth, their own garbage, so they would pack up and move to another clean location. They were simply commune, in communes, communistic. It was supposed to have brought them peace. That's what Karl Marx said communism would bring. It is known. I mean, I had pupils tell me that the white man came and destroyed those peaceful Indians. The condition of the bodies we found shows that they were as addicted to warfare as any other group, if not more so, because a lot of the, particularly the male skeletons we find, they were killed apparently in some kind of a war, some kind of a battle. So they were not just peaceful, they were warlike also. Apparently, again, they started with a high level of civilization. The civilization came rather suddenly, and then, in a lot of cases, disappeared. Now, in Central America and Mexico, their civilization did not disappear so fast. And these people were what we would consider civilized even when the Europeans arrived. These were the Aztecs and the Maya. The Maya and Aztecs and the Incas. Three groups of Indians that were still civilized. But I'm going to back up and start beginning. The oldest civilization we know of, Olmec. We don't know a lot about the Olmec civilization, but we have dug into using archaeology. And it looks like, folks, that these people came from Africa. Now, I've had more than one African student approach me and say, yes, that they've heard that themselves. Their mask, their face mask, show a lot of African features with the typical African thick lips and African hair types. They also show pictures of tigers that do not exist in Latin America. So the Olmec civilization, again, appears to have had its roots in Africa. Apparently, they came across the Atlantic Ocean, set up a civilization in Africa similar to some civilization in Mexico, similar to what they had seen in Africa, and started off with a fairly high level of civilization. Anyway, again, we don't know much about the Olmec. Then, after the Olmec, there came Teotih. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. The city right here, this is all one word. If any of you know how to pronounce that, then you're welcome to try it. I'm not going to attempt it. It's been called America's first metropolis. This city was in Mexico, lasted about 1,000 years. Now, folks, it's ironic in view of what happened today. I mean, what's going on today? Today, Mexico lags behind the rest of North America, particularly the United States and Canada. But at this time, Mexico was the most advanced part of the Americas. What is today Mexico? While a lot of the rest of the Americas, both North and South, were lagging. We do know this about them, and this is a problem that all these Mexican civilizations had. They practiced human sacrifice. And this was one of the reasons, as I've mentioned in the study guide, the last study guide I gave you, one of the reasons that Cortez felt it was his God-given duty to destroy their civilization. The concept of human sacrifice was just simply anathema to the Spaniards. The next civilization I want to talk about is the Maya. Now, when I first came to this college back in the year 2000, I asked the question, when does the Maya calendar end? No one knew. The chances are more than half of you, not all of you, know when the Maya calendar ended. Maya calendar, who knows? When did it end? Yes?
Wasn't it like December of 2012? But then
December
they found,
21st, 2012, yeah.
But then they found something else indicating that it hadn't really ended. They just didn't continue it for...
Well, what they also point out said, well, your calendar ends December 31st, and when your calendar ends, all you do is start a new one. Well, we have a calendar end December 31st every year, and then the next day we just simply pick up a new calendar, throw the old one in a trash can, start a new one. January 1st. But anyway, a lot of persons attached a lot of significance to what's going to happen in December 31st, 2012. Essentially, nothing happened. Now, I've been through about 3 or 4 doomsdays. In February 5th, 1961, some Hindu astrologers predicted the end of the Earth because of rare alignment of planets. But it got worse. I mean, nothing happened, by the way. In the spring of 1981, all the planets got on the same side of the sun. Most of your children remember that. Of course, this was supposed to be disaster. It was supposed to cause the sun to nova and go into a state of shock with all the planets tugging at it once. The day came and the day went, and again, absolutely nothing happened. And of course, another doomsday was September 24th of last year, which happens to be my wedding anniversary. Because of an experiment with CERN, it was supposed to blow up the Earth. I mean, the CERN experiment was supposed to go awry. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? CERN. Well, some people still blame a big earthquake in Chile on account of what CERN was doing, but we've had earthquakes all along. Anyway, leaving that, I've been through about 3 or 4 big doomsdays, of which they came and they went. Oh yeah, of course, December 21st, 2012 was another supposed doomsday.
Y2K.
20 what?
Y2K.
Oh yeah, thanks for reminding me. Yeah, Y2K computers. And they actually, with the whole world, grounded all of its airplanes on December 31st. Every airplane was on the ground, and then they went back up again once they found out the computers were actually working. They didn't not be, a few computers did go back to the year 1900. And at Lockheed, some of our older computers did in fact jump back to the year 1900. But we eventually they got fixes for that, or we just tolerated that, and well, okay, it means 2000, not 1900. Now about the Mayans also. Back in 1976, I visited Central America, and I saw the Mayan city of Copan. Copan has a very large pyramid that actually is more massive than the Great Pyramid of Giza, but it's not as tall. It covers more space. It's made of earth also, so it's not made of heavy rocks. But in 1976, the Maya script had not been deciphered. We had, originally they had 9 books the Spanish found. The Spanish destroyed 5 of them, and that left 4. But we had a lot of writings, so they felt like if we really try hard, we can decipher it. Some scholars learned the language of the Maya. Some Maya still speak their native old language. And I said to myself, if we ever get those scripts deciphered, I'd like to look at it. Well, we got them deciphered. And no, I don't care to look at them. I told you how the Spanish priest learned how to read them. And he started telling his friends, there about what they said. And the Spanish decided these writings are the writings of the devil. The Mayan writings do contain a lot of stuff that have to do with human sacrifice, and also of persons opening up their veins until their mind goes into hallucinations, and they believe that what they see is a vision from their gods, and then they'll close up their veins again and hopefully come back to their senses. But they believe that what they saw while they're in. Now, how many of you ever heard of this from other sources? This is written in the Maya script. One of you have heard it. Yeah, this is written in the Maya script. But at the same time, they have a story in there about the Garden of Eden that reminds us a whole lot of the Genesis story of Eve and the serpent. Their dating of the event, 4004 BC, is almost right within the same year of the same event, the dating of the same event as told in the book of Genesis. So they, it looks like, something else, they have a zodiac that resembles the 12 zodiac signs that is found all over the world, including among all civilized people, including the Maya, including the Chinese, including the Europeans. They might not use the same symbols, but the basic idea is there, that there are 12 signs of zodiac. They have observed their creation story is in the book, and it's similar to the creation story of Genesis. They were astronomers, and they used astronomy to make their calendar. So much of their activity revolved around the planet Venus. And folk, this I cannot quite prove from the text, but I have read that they knew more about the planet Venus than could be learned without satellites. I mean, they knew that Venus has phases. We did not discover that until we invented a telescope. But they also seemed to know about some of the mountains on Venus. I've got to quit. Things that we did not find out until I was older than you are, and most of you people are. When I was a youngster reading about the planets, and I used to read about it a lot, Venus was a mystery place surrounded by clouds, and nobody knew what lay underneath the clouds. Today we've mapped almost every square mile of it, and it shows a 28-mile-high mountain, and we wonder how can a mountain be 28 miles high when the surface temperature is 600 degrees and remain that way for millions of years. And some people decide, well, the planet Venus is really actually quite young, much younger than that. They engaged in an athletic contest. They made a ball out of rubber. They have some rubber trees down there. And here's the bad part about it. I was reading an article yesterday about how our athletic coaches in college and professional levels are told when or get fired, and they'll do anything to win a game, including possibly deflate footballs, and possibly, most likely, and this is an accusation been going on for every 50 years at least, they will pad a student's grades to make him eligible to play. And this was on a big article on MSN just yesterday. And the college that did it was Southern Methodist University. Padded the grades of one of its star players to make their team a winning team. Well, if you think that gives you incentive to win, in Mayan culture, the losers of the ball games were sacrificed. This is in the book, folks. Now, I promise you, this is in the book. I saw one of the Mayan ball courts. The ball court is pictured in your book. I went there one time and saw the big pyramidical pond, and Erica Pond was the ball field, surrounded by stadium on each side. And yes, we realized the losers were in fact sacrificed. The cities had a central pyramid, usually surrounded by a shrine, and nearby were the temples, the palaces, and the ball court. The Maya seem to have declined rather suddenly. It appears like they started building a lot of projects, then all of a sudden the projects came to an end. Now it reminds me of the year 2008 economic economy, where a lot of little shopping malls started going up around the city of Atlanta. Then all of a sudden the stock market had a big downturn, and all of a sudden construction on those areas stopped. Some of them have since been finished, and some of them are still lying there in ruins. A few of you might know what I'm talking about. But around my neighborhood, on my way home, I'll pass by one that's just recently a group has taken over and started to redevelop it. It's torn down the unfinished buildings, except for one they left standing. Torn down the rest of them, and they're working on it. But basically, they left a whole lot of buildings unfinished. We don't know why they declined, but reasons there might have been drought. And this is something else that the environmentalists love to point out. It's known that the Maya cleared away jungle, or otherwise known as rainforest. And yes, I saw a little bit of a rainforest once, but the rainforest gets so thick you can stick out your hand and can't see your hand. And you don't know what might be there ready to bite your hand either, so you don't want to get too deep. And you step inside the rainforest and you think you can find your way out, but unless you're highly trained, you can't see anything on any side. You don't know where you are. And you can easily get lost in them. Hopelessly lost, really, unless some dog comes in and finds you. But you can easily get hopeless because you can't see anything for the tall grasses. But the Mayas is known to have cleared away a lot of the rainforest. They might have overcultivated the land. We don't know if they practiced crop rotation or fertilization. And also, farming in tropical areas is tricky. Yes, you can farm year-round, but yes, there's all kinds of parasites and plant diseases. So, very tricky to say the least. There might have been rebellion. There might have been an invasion from outside. There might have been a volcano eruption. But when the Spanish arrived, they found the Maya fairly divided, with no major cities anymore. All their large cities were abandoned. And the Spanish had an easy time conquering them. Now, abandoned cities is dotting the globe. We'll talk about them some more, particularly when it comes to Southeast Asia. There's a big city of Angkor Wat that may have had more than 100,000 or so people. But a lot of African cities have been abandoned. A lot of cities south of the Sahara Desert in Africa. Big, bright, one-time cities then abandoned. The Aztecs, these were the Indians that Cortez met. We don't know where they came from. Now, lately we think they came from what is today New Mexico and started out small. They had to make treaties with their more powerful neighbors, but they eventually became more powerful than their neighbors. They set out to conquer their neighbors, and they eventually did. By the time the Cortez arrived, they'd long had for hundreds of years an empire that included almost all of Mexico. These were the Indians that Cortez met and that Cortez destroyed. Again, you can fault the Spanish folk. My own personal take on it is that Indians invited their own disaster by not abandoning the practice of human sacrifice. I mean, I have to be honest, I don't know what today we'd do if we were to someday stumble on a civilization that practiced human sacrifice. Today's political correctness would say, if that's the way they want to live, who are we to say that they should live any different? Let them live their own life, their own way, and just don't. Cortez did not feel that way. Cortez felt like these people are demoniac, and it's my duty to civilize and Christianize them, and to do that I have to destroy them. So he proceeded to promptly destroy them. The American Indians had no resistance to the diseases of smallpox, particularly smallpox and typhus. So, what Cortez and the Spanish men did not kill, disease nearly wiped out until it almost destroyed 90% of the Indian population. Granted, Christopher Columbus has been called a mass murderer. But I'll remind you of something, folks. Christopher Columbus had his flagship dashed to pieces on the rocks. I mean, they did not charted territory, so he could not take every one of his crew back. So he left some of his crew in the island of Hispaniola, went back to Spain, came back and found all the crewmen who he left were killed. This set the tone for some 390 years, almost 400 years of fight between European and Indians, in which the Indians lost. You can't be sure if the white men drew the first blood of the Indians, but from Columbus's point of view, it was all the Indians' fault. So he believed the Indians had drawn first blood, so he used that as justification for killing them. He's been called a mass murderer. Again, if any of us had been there, there's a good chance we might have done the same thing. Particularly when Cortez heard the hideous screams coming from the temple and asked his interpreter, what's the meaning of these screams? Oh, these are people having their hearts cut out, being offered to sacrifice the sun god.
Can't you kind of say that just like Salem witch trials or Christians burning people?
Oh, you can compare it. No, well, because the Spanish, with all due respect to Cortez, they were guilty of the Inquisition, which I'll talk about later, killing people who disagreed with them, killing Protestants and killing Jews and driving the Jews out. They were guilty also, but they thought this was justifiable. War has evil on both sides, pure and simple. Everybody has something wrong with him or her, no exceptions. I had an uncle one time who said there's something crazy about every one of us. This has proven to be very, very true, and even your great men have something wrong with them. The Europeans were not completely guiltless, and the Spanish were not. They're not guiltless. The Indians were not either. It became a matter of who was the strongest. Well, 4 things helped Cortez win. Number 1, the Aztec tax collectors would go through and they would take anything they wanted, including the young girls and wives of the people, to use as sex slaves. So Cortez was able to recruit half of the Indian population on his side. So his army consisted of tens of thousands of Indians who wanted to overthrow Montezuma. So he divided the Indians. Number 2 was the fear. The Indians looked on a Spanish man on a horse, as being one person with 2 heads. The Indians had never seen horses, keep in mind. So they believed that these Spanish were gods. That was a fear factor. The other was disease. The Indians had no immunity to smallpox and typhus, and it wiped them out. Let's see if I can think of the 4th one. Oh yes, half of Montezuma's army would not fight. So he had an army of about 100,000 men, half of them wouldn't fight. The battle was bloody, but when it was over with, Montezuma's forces were defeated. Cortez was the conqueror, and Cortez, with no more than 200 white men, conquered Mexico with Montezuma's army of 100,000 men. Oh, they were afraid. Oh yeah, the Indians were afraid of the Spanish cannon and the Spanish rifles. They had never seen anything like it. So basically, the Indians thought the Europeans were gods and that they were fighting against gods. So all these factors contributed to the Spanish winning. The Aztecs became slaves. The Incas lived in what is today Peru. The Europeans crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw what they call the South Sea, which we today know as the Pacific Ocean. But if you look at Panama, the ocean was to the south. The Spanish then went on to make war with the Incas. And again, the Incas did not have guns, did not have cannon, did not have horses. The Spanish won the fight. The Inca chieftain recognized the Spanish desire for gold, and he said one day to Pizarro, Pizarro was a conqueror, if you ever read the Superman books, they feature a character named Bizarro, spelled the same way except with a B. Any of you know what I'm talking about? No, yes, okay, anyway. There was a character in the Superman book named Bizarro. But anyway, this is Bizarro. Anyway, this Inca chieftain told Pizarro, I can fill this room with gold as high as I can reach. The Inca chieftain was about 6 foot tall. He said, I can fill it half full of gold. The room was about the size of a classroom, maybe smaller than this room, maybe about the size of from here over. The Inca chieftain proceeded to fill the room half full of gold as high as he could reach. Pizarro killed the Inca chieftain anyway. Pizarro paid for that. He was eventually murdered by one of his own men. But this gold, number one, we have no idea where it came from. I mean, the Spanish could not imagine so much gold anywhere. Number two, this gold was shipped back to Europe, and it, for the first time since the Roman Empire days, Europe began to have gold again, and gold began to circulate, and Europe began to have money and began to base their economy on a money-based economy. You can criticize Europeans for stealing the gold, justifiably so. Again, what we would do today is anybody's question. Anybody?
So they were right for doing it.
All right. You have to. I don't want to go that far.
No.
What I want to say is, men are what men are, women are what women are. If you had been alive back then, if you had not come over, one of your cousins would have, or your brothers or sisters would have, somebody else would have. And the ones who did felt like the people they were dealing with were uncivilized or were basically they called savages, among other uncomplimentary names. I don't want to call them, but I have to. It's a historical fact that they called them that. So they felt like any move they made against these uncivilized people was justified. Just one thing led to another, and eventually the white persons enslaved them and stole what they had from them of value. This is a historical fact. Was it wrong? Perhaps. But it was done. Well, I have to say perhaps because, again, well, I can't make a good claim that it was right, but again, it's basically what human nature does. Now, I have to say this about human nature. There we have enemies outside this country who would come in today and take everything they have we could. Mankind is no more civilized today than he was then. Our enemies, and we have them, would, and all of you know who I'm talking about. The only reason they don't is we have an army that's powerful enough to defend us. When we become weaker, and I believe we will, we'll be conquered, and all of our wealth will be taken away from us. This is simply human nature. This is the way it happens. This is the way it goes. And right or wrong is not the issue so much as it happens. If we continue to weaken ourselves, to conduct ourselves in such a way that civilized people always have done, to where they get conquered by the uncivilized, we can expect the same thing to happen to us as happened to them. Yes?
I think that you're referring to like the Middle East and everything, but I think it's pretty funny when I think like this guy's like 13 people, Americans have been killed in the Middle East this year, and like 1,500 people have been killed by cops this year. So what outside force are you talking about that's doing it?
Okay, the outside forces I'm talking about, we have enemies. Want me to name them? It's the mainland Chinese, number one. The whole Muslim world, number two.
The whole Muslim world?
Okay.
You might want to.
I want to repeat.
You might want to rephrase that.
The entire
That's
Muslim world, number two. I'm sorry, I said it.
I mean,
I'm not going to back down on it. I'm not going to
ridiculous.
back up on it. That's what I said, and that's what we need to stand on
read
and
the
fall.
Quran?
Number three, what used to be the Soviet Union, Russia.
Oh,
If these people would unite, I'm talking, now wait a minute. All right, ridicule it all you want to.
I mean,
If China
you just said a
and
whole
Islam
religion is our enemy.
and Russia would unite, guess what? We've
Should we put
learned.
patches on them as well? Or-
Okay, that's, folks, it can happen. If they unite, the United States, we don't realize, Great Britain is hard, well, France is hardly armed. Germany is very poorly armed. Sweden doesn't even have an army anymore.
But it's
We
also
have
one of the
few
best
friends.
economies out there right now.
It has no
that
army.
does guaranteed income to their people.
Okay,
Because the IMF has proved if you give to the bottom 10%, that economies will boost more than giving to the rich. Like trickle-downomics has been said.
Okay, you're not the first one. I've had a few how many of you think that the United States cannot lose a war?
We've lost war. We've lost Vietnam.
How many think that the United States cannot, but how many of you think that the United States is invincible and can never be conquered by outside enemies? How many of you think the United States could? Okay, well, all right. All right, well, all right. There's nobody that can't be conquered. Yes?
I mean, the issue with the war nowadays is everyone has the atomic bomb. No one can
Well,
That's, yeah, well, that is a huge issue.
Well, what's actually interesting about that is, like, in my opinion, I don't think the Cold War has ever ended because we literally we're building missile defense systems to the left of, west of Ukraine, and that's what the whole Ukraine crisis is because NATO is infringing upon Russia. And literally, we're talking about building a missile defense system which blocks nukes in South Korea because of North Korea's local,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
It's probably based off the Iron Dome technology. The Israelis developed something called the Iron Dome, and it shoots down any missile that comes into Israel.
that's pretty much like what we're building.
Basically, we don't know what would happen if there were, because we don't know what secrets our government's keeping from us, and we don't know what secrets that the enemy has. So we have no idea, but we don't know what would happen. All right, now anyway, I'll have to move on. A good call, good discussion. In other words, I'll get back to the original. Was it right? It simply was. And I've had persons who say that they condemned the white man for what he did to the Indians. You can if you want to, but the other side of it is, if you had been there, if you had not done the deed, your cousins, your buddies, your friends, somebody else would have. If England had not come over, France would have. Or if Spain, when Spain didn't, well, if Spain wouldn't have, Germany would have. And eventually a lot of them did come. The Arawak, A-R-A-W-A-K. The Arawak today are extinct. But if you look at the DNA, more than half of the Indians living in or near the Caribbean have Arawak DNA. Today, though, they're looked on as being extinct, and it's said that the Europeans came in, wiped them out. By the way, I must mention the diseases went both ways. Yes, the Europeans spread typhus and smallpox among the Indians, but it is rumored, now again, you can deny this because it can't be proven, it's rumored that the Indians spread syphilis to the Europeans. That syphilis was carried back to Europe by a man on one of Columbus's crew, first trip. And once in Europe, it spread like wildfire only among certain segments of the European population. And European doctors quickly recognized how it spread, but it was to be many, many years before they could get a cure. And I'll say this about syphilis. The strain of syphilis that's going around today cannot be cured. Now, how many of you heard that besides? All right, well, at least one hand went up. But syphilis going on today there's a strain that our doctors cannot handle. Once you have it, you always have it. It still can cause dementia, sterility, blindness, and death. And if anything, it's more dangerous than it ever was. 50 years ago, we thought we had it eradicated, but it made a big comeback. Now, the Arawak, I must mention this, folk. The Arawak had equality between their men and women. You can decide for yourself what that means. I did make mention of it, I believe, some 10 days ago in a class, 12 days ago. The Arawak had equality between men and women. Today they're extinct. All right, I've said my lines there on that. If you want to discuss it further, you can.
So do you really think Muslims are like biggest threat? You said second. Well, not.
Well, listen, number one, we have given them the arms they can use to fight us.
Yeah, that was before. Yeah, that was what Bush did.
And number two,
So
there are, I believe, what are they, the first or second biggest religion on the face of the earth? What they need, all right, here's why Islam is lost. Islam has continually lost its wars because they'll start fighting among themselves. And what's going on today? Syria is fighting Syria, Libya is fighting Libya,
It's not like
Egypt
the
is fighting
Protestants fought the
Egypt.
Catholics.
But if, now wait, but if they could get some man among them who could unite them, I'll stop right there. All right, go ahead and scoff. Go ahead and
I just think it's funny just to think of religion as an enemy, because like, I don't know. But
Well-
the Quran is actually one of the most peaceful books there is out of all the three basic religions, where it actually doesn't, negate women like the Bible does. And, I mean, have you read the Quran? I mean, because I've read both. And, so, I mean, if you want to,
Go ahead, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You have any comment?
I'm not supporting the whole Muslim thing,
Yeah.
but on what he said about the Quran being non-violent, it's just a book, and you can't expect to put politics into it. So, you have a lot of Christians that say they're Christian and super Christian, but it's not like they follow their own rules. It's not up to the book or the religion, but it's more up to the people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's like I said, Afghanistan women can't drive cars, but there's nothing in the Quran that says whatsoever that women cannot ride, like camel or, back in the day, whatever they were. But it's also, like you said, everyone interprets it differently.
I'm not going to comment. We'll come to the chapter on Islam next. And again, must mention, in South America, you have the Nazca lines. When you're on the ground, walking along, you don't even realize the Nazca lines are there. But when you get in an airplane and look down, they show up. They are very, either they're long straight to go straight for miles, and folk, it's just impossible to have lines going straight for miles without some kind of technology that is highly advanced. And even your authors will mention that some people believe that they were directed by operations from a spaceship where they served as a guide. But some of the Nazca lines are pictures of animals, again, to where you cannot see the whole animal except from very high up in an airplane. Have any of us, I mean, this is in the book, folk. It's, yes?
Which civilization is it? They have like their drawings and carvings, like things that look like turtles flying through the sky. And it's looking, probably in South America. But
Yeah, they have all kinds of animal figures and drawings that do not show up as such until you get, go ahead, what's that?
I remember seeing something about like fish and dolphins being present in places where it was like not possible for them to even, like knew that dolphins were incredibly intelligent, more so like not even, I don't know how they would have done that, but that
Yeah.
our gods had like sent dolphins as like a mediator or something.
It is known that the South American Indians had the balloon, but they did not use it to fly with it. They actually would take their balloons, put dead bodies in them, and then send the balloons, and the balloons would fly over the ocean, and eventually the balloons would drop their cargo to where a person that way would be buried in the Pacific Ocean. This was done by the Latin American Indians, but you have to ask yourself, well, if they had the balloon, why didn't they want to fly in them themselves? As far as we know, the idea never occurred to them. They just simply used the balloons as ways to dispose of their dead bodies. Generally, again, not just the Arawak, but most of the Indians had equality between men and women. And again, I think the problem was they simply did not have the ability to organize. In the fight between European and Indian, it was almost like it was destined that the Indians were going to lose. Typically, particularly this is true in North America, nor what is today the United States and Canada, Indian women would have no more than 1 or 2 babies per woman. Then the Europeans came in, and the European women were averaging 6 to 10 babies per woman. Not to mention, Europeans kept coming over. So pick the winner. It was not that the Indians didn't have guns, but then a few years after the white man came, the Indians got the guns and knew how to use them. The Indians got the horses and knew how to ride them. They became excellent horsemen. They even became excellent shots, but they lacked the ability to organize. One day, a bunch of them, 2,000 or 3,000 of them, got together and stayed together for a few weeks, and during that time they met Custer's army. Custer had 277 men, and they wiped out Custer's entire army. It's called Custer's Last Stand. Then they got to fighting among themselves and split up, and it was fragmented. They simply could not hold themselves together, and they could not understand how that the white man obeyed a great, what they called the great chief in Washington, namely our president, whom we never see. So why don't we follow a man whom we never see? They would only follow the man who could command their leadership, and their tribes were no more than maybe a few hundred people. They were farmers. They had the potato, which they gave to the world, the corn. What we call corn is actually maize. And I must say this about corn. Some of you heard, corn is one of the least nutritious foods you can eat. I see one head nodding, a couple of you may have heard that. Corn is not the most not a nutritious food. But they had the gourds, squash. They had squash, and they gave the world tobacco, for whatever that's worth. But they did not have the horse, the ox, the pig, the sheep, the goat. They did not even have the cat. They did have dogs, but they didn't have the cat. So they were missing, for the way their clients were missing rye and wheat and barley and oats. So they were missing a lot of things that might have benefited them if they had them. They'd never, not one tribe that we know of, ever even had a wheel. Maybe because it wasn't that they weren't intelligent enough to invent one. The problem that they had with a wheel was they simply probably did not need one. The only large animal they had was the llama. The Incas and the Indians in South America had llamas. That was the only pack animal they had, but they didn't have the camel, the equine, the donkey, the mule, the horse. So they were missing a whole lot of things that the Europeans had and the Europeans brought over. Regrettably, they fought a long, long war with a white man and lost. Your book calls them stateless people. That's another high-class way of saying tribal peoples, or peoples who did not have a higher level of organization. No bigger than their organization was no bigger than a tribe that would pack up and move from place to place. So therefore, they were no match for the European who came in droves and wound up defeating them. All right. Which pretty well finishes us up with chapter 6. Again, I'll get in my car later today and think of all the things I could have said, and maybe come vacation time I will say. Anyway, we'll move on to chapter 7, Islam. I'm going to be spending 2 class periods on Islam, again owing to the fact that it's extremely important in today's world. 50 years ago, folk, the Islamic world was ignored. We hardly realized it was there. Today it is making big, big news. The background to Islam, it started in Arabia. The Middle Eastern world where civilization had started had been in a state of disarray for centuries. Disunited, it was suddenly quickly united again for a very short time, then it fragmented, and it's been fragmented to this day. Islam was started in Arabia. Islam was started in Arabia, and it was to wind up spreading all the way from Spain to the Indus Valley. for several hundred years, they actually had Spain. I mean, not all of it, part of it. But they became disunited. In the case of Arabia, Arabia was a big peninsula located close to the civilized world. It was a vast desert land, and several historians have written about it, but we don't have any records of the Arabs themselves. If they wrote anything much, their writings have not come down to us. What we know about them was that they lived on oases in the desert. You know, it was in a desert. The desert will have some places where there are springs of water or little ponds. And around these oases, people will build cities, sometimes small towns, depending on how big the oasis is, how much water they have. And persons would travel from one oasis to another, to persons selling their wares. For a time, the Silk Road went through northern Arabia. Now, the Silk Road was destined to change routes almost with every generation, depending on the political situation that was involved at the time. But the Arabs had a lot of caravans that went in and out of the outside world. The Romans went in and they had conquered Arabia. They had found that most of its people were poor Bedouins. The word Bedouin basically means, it's similar to nomad, a desert wanderer. They tended to be nomadic, moved from one place to place. Some of them, though, became traders. They would have the habit of these tribes would sneak in on another oasis, sneak in, quickly grab as much as they could in the way of people, humans, and goods and food and whatever else they could grab, and then run. These little wars were called jihads. The jihad was to become the holy war of Islam later. But they would engage in these little raiding parties called jihads. These people were fiercely loyal to their tribe, and oftentimes that meant that they could not unite because their tribal loyalty was more important than their loyalty to the nation. Their religion was, now this is before Islam, their religion was polytheistic. Now, again, your book says that Allah was the chief spirit over other spirits. Some accounts say that Allah was just another one of the lesser spirit gods who did not control over the other spirits, but eventually he became the top deity of the Arab people. All right. In the city of Mecca, and this is basically close to where Muhammad was born, where Muhammad lived. In the city of Mecca, there was a stone that has been said to have dropped down from heaven. The stone is still there. Probably it's a meteorite, even though, because it's sacred, no scientist is allowed to examine it. But a stone was said to have dropped down from heaven, and this stone became a sacred stone. And around this stone, now this is not still existing, but there were 360 idols, one for each day of the year. Now I know you're going to say there are 365 days of the year, but in those days, their calendar only had 360 days. 360 idols, one for each day of the year. And it was located at what's called the Kaaba, which still stands, the Kaaba. All right, into this scenario, and I'm out of time, just about. Into this scenario, young Muhammad was born. By the way, something that's very, very important. The people of Arabia had no priest. The word priest means a person who mediates between the gods and humans. And there were no shamans, no priest. Everyone had direct access to their gods, so everyone took part in a religion. Because of the wars that were going on between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, the trade routes went pretty deep into Arabia to escape the wars. Well, the result was a wealthy merchant class that came into conflict with the Bedouin, with the ordinary poor Bedouin people. Now, I will tell you, like on a somewhat a personal note, I grew up in poverty. And when you grow up in poverty, you're taught that the rich are snakes. They got to be rich by stealing. You can't get rich any other way except by conniving and stealing. And they don't realize, number one, that they're doing it themselves as much as they can, and also being critical. But they hate the rich. The poor oftentimes do. Well, picture Muhammad. He grew up poor, and all of a sudden he himself became rich. And this led to a whole lot of conflicts in his mind, because it was like he had always been taught to hate the rich are vile, the rich are evil. Now all of a sudden he is one. He got to be wealthy by marrying his widowed boss. His boss was a widow woman who was quite wealthy, so he married into wealth. And his own personal wealth led him into conflict with his, well, you might say a theological conflict. And this was to lead to him founding a new religion that incorporated a whole lot of Judaism, and yes, that Islamic people do consider Jewish writings to be sacred, and the Jewish prophets to have been holy men. Particularly, they admire the prophet Ezekiel. They're also admirers of Abraham, Isaiah, Jeremiah. They incorporated some of Judaism and some of Christianity and some of the old Arab religions, the religion of the desert, to make the religion of Islam that we know of today. All right. Muhammad's parents died when he was 6 years old, and that also had a lot to do with his feeling lost. But eventually he became a caravan manager, married a widow woman who was wealthy, and lived for several years as a rich merchant. But at heart he was still a Bedouin. And so he began going to the hills nearby to meditate. And when he went to the hills, he said that the Archangel Gabriel had come to him and shown him a new way. And the Archangel Gabriel told him that, hey, the other prophets before you, Moses and Jesus and the other ones before you, they only got part, but I'm going to give you the full revelation. And you are going to be Allah's new prophet. You're being given the full truth. So out of his messages came the holy book of Islam called the Quran. And I am going to stop there, and we'll take up with that next time, on Wednesday. Everybody have a good couple of days, and I want to say this about Islam. Before I am aware that there may be Islamic persons in the class. Your opinions are welcome, your comments are welcome. You're welcome in this class. And hopefully what I say will not be too offensive to you. Everyone have a good couple of days, and we'll resume.